So today's lesson, Genesis flood washing away millions of years. And again, I want to acknowledge the two groups I've been acknowledging so far, Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research, and I'll be playing some of their videos as well. So today's outline, talk about 4 views of the Genesis flood. And then the Genesis flood, its purpose, character, and depth. How long does it take to make fossils like these I have up front? One's a small trilobite, and another one is like a seashell fossil, and then we got a fish that was captured. Whoops. We have a fish that was captured. It was fossilized so fast it even has the shape of the soft shell, or it looks almost real. And how long to make and erode rocks? So we'll cover that. So when we look at this picture, we look at the picture of the Grand Canyon with thousands of feet of strata layers of rock. When and how was this all formed? How did these layers of rocks get there? If you listen to the evolutionists, they'll tell you these rock layers represent the history of the development of life on Earth. They'll start down here in the Precambrian and Cambrian layers, and they'll say simple creatures were at the bottom of the rock layers, and as we go higher into the rock layers, we see creatures evolving into different kinds of creatures, and eventually evolving into dinosaurs, then birds, then eventually man. So according to evolution, the timeline represents 3.5 billion years from a single cell all the way up to man. This is what most people believe today. Is this the correct interpretation of the rocks that we see in the Grand Canyon? And what does the Genesis global flood have to do with washing away millions of years? The Genesis flood is absolutely critical to the question of the history of the earth. If you study the writings of people who believe in an old earth, most of them ignore the global flood. They'll tend to focus on Genesis 1, and they'll try to figure out how to fit millions of years into Genesis 1, whether it's the days were millions of years, or we'll put millions of years between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, or their day age. So let's look at the 4 views of the Genesis flood that's been held in church history. The first is called the historical global catastrophe view, and every word in that is important. The view says the flood was historical. It really happened in time and space in Earth's history. It was global and covered the entire planet, like we talked about last week. There was no dry land anywhere when the flood reached its highest point. It was a catastrophe, and it was a flood of unimaginable, catastrophic destruction. This view was a universal belief for the church for the first 18 centuries after Christ. But in the early 19th century, when the idea of millions of years was born, this view began to be rejected. It was replaced by some other views. One of them was called the historical local catastrophe. This view held to the flood really happened in time-space history, but it was localized just in the Mesopotamia Valley, in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates River near modern-day Iraq. And they held to it was described in Genesis, but it was exaggerated language. Other people said, no, it wasn't. It was a global flood, but it was historical and peaceful flood. It was so peaceful and tranquil that it left no geological evidence. Therefore, we don't have to harmonize the flood with a geological record. Actually, a global peaceful flood, if you think about it, doesn't make sense. It's kind of an oxymoron. There is no such thing as a global peaceful flood. In fact, there's no such thing as a peaceful flood at all, and I'll show you an example. You've probably experienced them. All floods are destructive. All floods erode material from one place and then carry it and deposit it to someplace else. A flood that leaves no evidence is really not a flood. It's probably a mythological flood. So I work for the National Weather Service, and we issue thousands of flood warnings every year. We issue a flood warning almost every week, sometimes during in fact, we have a flood watch out today for this area, for the rain that's coming in. It's raining now into tonight. And every year we do damage survey investigations to document the events, and all floods cause levels of damage in their wake. And do not know anyone today, though, who holds to a global peaceful flood. So that leads to the fourth view, and that view is of liberal theologians, and they call it a myth, the myth of the Genesis flood. Liberal theologians hold to this. They say if you believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, you can believe in the Genesis flood. They believe it never happened, just like the ancient Babylons, the ancient Assyrians, and the ancient Egyptians had flood myths, so did the Hebrews. So I want to present to you just a few of the biblical reasons for believing that it was a global catastrophic flood. First of all, we talked about this last week. I'll reiterate it. Let's consider the purpose of the flood. The purpose of the flood was not specific, just to destroy sinful man only. The purpose of the flood, and we'll read in Genesis 6:7, was, "So the Lord, I will destroy man, whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man, beast, creeping thing, and the birds of the air. For I am sorry that I have made them." In verse 13, "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." So the purpose of the flood was to destroy sinful man and all the land animals and all the creeping things and all the birds and the earth itself. It just wasn't sinful man. And only a global flood could fulfill that purpose. If the flood was localized, then it would not kill all the land animals and all the birds. The animals and birds living in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Antarctica, remember we said it was tropical in Antarctica before the flood, and Australia could care less whether there's a flood in the Middle East. Only a global flood could destroy all the animals, birds, and the earth. Secondly, the purpose of the flood was not to save a few animals, so Noah could start a farm after the flood. The purpose of the ark is clearly spelled out in Genesis chapter 7. Verses 1 through 3. "Then the Lord said to Noah, Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 of each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female, and 7 each of the birds of the air, male and female, and the reason to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth." So if the flood was local, then this massive ark bringing all these animals in would be completely unnecessary. It was ridiculous for a building project for God to give to Noah. All God had to do to know if it was going to be a local flood is say, "Hey, Noah, I'll let you in on a secret. I plan to send a flood. Why don't you go to another area? Why don't you take a vacation in Europe or take a vacation in Africa? And I'll send this flood here, and then you can come back afterwards." If it was a local flood, the animals and birds have no problem. They often sense natural disaster coming. Often animals sense bad weather or forest fire, and they'll move out of that danger zone. Even if they were killed in a floodplain with a local flood, animals living outside the flood zone would just migrate back in after the flood and repopulate the area. So only a global flood fits the purpose of the ark, because if it was global, there would be no place for any creature or man to survive. I want to bring this up. Often in children's books, we see pictures of Noah's Ark looking something like this picture here. It looks like a small, overcrowded, bathtub-like boat with the giraffes up through the chimney, like they can't fit in. And you got monkeys hanging from the windows, and you got a wave coming in. That elephant looks scared. It paints a picture that Noah's ark's too small, and Noah could not fit all the animals on the ark. It implies that Noah's ark was a fairy tale. So we need to remove this completely from our mind. Nothing could be further from the truth. Actually, when you look at the true size of the ark, the Bible gives the dimensions. It was 1.5 football fields long. Last week I talked about 510 feet long with the cubits, remember? And here is a picture of a football field next to the size of the ark. And you can see it's larger than the size of a football field. So that's a really long ark. Also, the width is 2/3 of a football field. It doesn't show in this picture, but the dimensions come out that size. And it was 4 stories tall. So this isn't those tiny bathtub arks. The real ark was massive. Using the ark size, 510 feet by 85 feet by 51 feet, we can calculate a volume of 2,210,850 cubic feet. A standard 53-foot semi-trailer has a volume of approximately 4,000 cubic feet. So the volume of the ark was equivalent to 500 semi-trailers. So no boat was built this big again until 1860. So this was a very, very large ark. 500 semi-trailers. That's how much volume could fit into the ark. So what about the character of the flood? The character of the flood was not a spring rain to water the garden. This was a rain and flood that was an expression of the holy wrath of God. And we read this, and we read this last week, Genesis 7, verses 11 and 12. And it reads, "On the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. The floodgates of heaven were opened. The rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights." So envision a monsoon rain happening 24 hours a day, much heavier than we're seeing today, for 40 consecutive days. It would have caused massive mudslides, tsunamis like we have never seen before, the fountains of the deep breaking open and the subterranean water bursting under the earth, and the crust breaking apart. So to get a sense of it, let's look at some of the instances we have today. When we talk about monsoonal rains and mudslides, here's a picture of a mudslide in California, but this was one local flood. Imagine a worldwide flood and the mudslides it would produce. Also imagine earthquakes and thousands of volcanoes erupting as the fountains of the deep. Remember I said those scars in the ocean? 40,000 miles long, and all that erupting everywhere across the globe. Also imagine the fountains of the great deep opening up and causing global scale tsunamis larger than any tsunami we've ever experienced. This is a picture of the tsunami in Japan in March 2011, and you probably remember how much damage it caused. Does anybody remember that one? I see people shaking their heads. How that happened was an earthquake in the bottom of the ocean displaces the water, and it caused a tsunami wave to travel thousands of miles across the ocean at speeds of 600 miles per hour. When they rise up and hit the land mass, they can carry ships over a mile inland and create incredible damage to the land. Here's a picture of example of what one local tsunami did to the coastal area in Japan. Imagine a worldwide tsunami with fountains of the deep bursting open 40,000 miles across the globe. That's beyond what our comprehension would be. This is just one tiny tsunami. So when we can combine earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and global tsunamis and flooding rainfall nonstop for 40 days and nights all over the earth simultaneously, you have catastrophic damage all across the globe. So the global flood was a violent catastrophe. All the plant material, and you can see in this cartoon, they're depicting trees being uprooted and being carried away with tsunami waves. So there was massive erosion and sedimentation across all the land areas worldwide. The depth of the flood, we talked about this last week, but I want to hit it again. And that's described in Genesis chapter 7, verses 19 and 20. And it says, "And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered." So 15 cubits turns out to be 25.5 feet above the highest mountains. And here's a picture of what the ark would look like floating safe above all the flooded waters. So when you consider the tsunami waves and mudslides and flooding rains every day all over the earth and drowning every land creature, what would you expect from a global flood? Here's a picture of a bunch of fossils. Well, you would expect billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth, and that's what we see. Evolutionists say millions of years of death, pain, killing, disease, thorn, struggle, suffering, extinction caused the fossil record. But the Bible says Noah's flood caused all this death, pain, killing, disease, thorn, struggle. So you can see the difference in worldviews. Now, early 19th century views of Earth history. And in the early 19th century is when the idea of millions of years was born. Up to that time, the biblical and traditional view, which was defended by a group of men called the scriptural geologists, they believed in a supernatural creation week, that's what SCW means, similar to all others in the first 18th century. God created everything in 6 24-hour days, 6,000 years ago. It was followed by 1,600 years later of the global flood, F, and then continued until the present time, P. This view was then replaced by what was called the catastrophist view, and there were two influential men, Cuvier and Smith. They're both Frenchmen and Englishmen, respectively. They believed in a supernatural beginning. They believed in God, but they imagined over the course of untold ages, millions of years, every so often there would be a regional or global catastrophe that destroyed much of the earth and much of the life on earth. And after each catastrophe, they believed that God created new creatures. So every C on that diagram, God was creating new creatures because they all died. This view reigned in geology for about 30 years. And then by about 1830, it was replaced by the uniformitarian view. And this view held to no regional, no global flood, no global catastrophes in Earth history. The process of geological change had been uniform all throughout history. Some may believe in a supernatural beginning, but notice there's no C's on that line, no catastrophes. They may have believed in small floods here or there, like we see today, and a volcano here and there during the course of a year, but they did not believe in any catastrophes like it describes in Genesis. By about 1840, the uniformitarian view became the ruling dogma of geology. This is where geology became a profession. From that time on, everyone was trained with this uniformitarian view. They disregarded the global flood. So the science journals and the geological associations were controlled by this uniformitarian view. Today, all geologists are taught that, and they all believe it. So let's bring in an important geologist. His name's Derek Ager. He was professor and head of the geology department at the University College of Swansea in Wales from 1968 to 1988, and he was president of the British Geological Association from 1988 to 1990. He visited 57 countries to look at the rocks, wrote 200 papers and 4 books, and wrote many short articles for the publication called The New Scientist. And this is what he wrote. My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I have been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, meaning the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day, more than by observations in the field. So look at the yellow text, significant statement. He's saying that the uniformitarians were controlled and influenced in their interpretation of the rocks more by social and political history of their day and not by the actual observations in the field. He goes on. In other words, we have allowed ourselves to be, what's the term, brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. So try to make it what he's saying. He took geology in high school. He learned it with a uniformitarian perspective. He went to undergraduate school and he learned geology with this uniformitarian perspective. He went to get his PhD taught by uniformitarian geologists. Think of evolutionists, think of non-biblical beliefs. So when he went out and looked at the rocks, he was thinking like a uniformitarian, so he's being brainwashed. But Dr. Ager was a world-class geologist. He studied on location, looking at geological formations in over 50 countries. The more he looked at the rocks, the more they began to say, these rocks are screaming catastrophe. The way I was trained, he said, to think in school was wrong. I was brainwashed. The evidence of catastrophe was always there, but I couldn't see it because of this brainwashing. So let's do a quick brainwashing exercise and see if I can brainwash everyone in the audience. So I want you to look at this diagram. What's missing? I want you to think about it, and then we'll have a short quiz. What was it originally? So look at that. All right. Got the mental picture. What was the original picture? Well, multiple choice. Does anyone vote for A? Anyone in the audience think the original picture was A? I don't see any hands. What about B? Not convincing anyone? What was the picture originally? What about C? Anyone want to vote for that one? Okay, what about D? Okay, I see hands, and so it looks like most of the people voted for D. Okay. You know what the answer is? Nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. What happened? I brainwashed you by asking you a simple question, what is missing? I was able to influence your mind to think something was missing. You thought I have to figure something that's missing and draw, connect the dots like a circle, right? I brainwashed you by asking you a question. I got you to think the way I wanted you to think, assuming something was missing, but it wasn't. This is what is done with evolution today. Derek Ager looked at this conglomerate near his home in Wales, and he said, this has usually been interpreted as the basal conglomerate of a dichroneous transgressive sea. It's been suggested with very little fossil evidence that this conglomerate spans 3 to 5 ammonite zones and therefore up to 5 million years in time. I think it was deposited in a matter of hours or minutes. So he opened his eyes and then started getting unbrainwashed. So the creationists, evolutionists, we have the same facts. We have the same Grand Canyon. We have the same rocks and fossils. But depending upon your starting assumption, if you're trained to be a evolutionists in millions of years, if you have anti-biblical assumptions, you'll view that as that's an old earth, no global flood. Those layers were laid down millions of years. But if you have biblical assumptions, then you could say, oh yeah, that's easy to understand. A young earth and a global flood happened. So Derek Ager was saying, I was brainwashed with a uniformitarian view, developed a set of assumptions like slow gradual processes, no catastrophes. So when I went and looked at the rocks, I couldn't see any evidence of a catastrophe. But it was more and more observations of the real world that began to show him that the assumptions were wrong. So if you go out without ruling out regional or global catastrophe before you even look at the evidence, you'll actually see the evidence. So it's a brainwashing. Let's transition. Like I said, I have the fossils up here. How long does it take to make fossils? Well, let's see what an evolutionist says. This is out of 101 questions about dinosaurs. And it says fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. A few hours, millions of years. Isn't that kind of a long time frame? What is it? That's almost too long, right? How do evolutionists know fossilization can take millions of years? Has any geologist lived long enough to observe this through empirical observations and science? No, of course not. Has the science of geology been in existence long enough so you can string together several geologists in their notebooks, and they shared their notebooks and observed empirically that it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? No. Science of geology has been only in existence for 200 years. So how do they know it takes millions of years for fossils to form? The answer is they don't. It's an assumption. It's a belief. The amount of time it takes for a bone to become completely mineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. And if the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, that sounds like what?
Mud.
Yep, sounds like the flood. Exactly. So that's what happened. Noah's flood was about 4,000 years ago, and Noah's flood, the groundwater heavily laden with minerals and water, and the land being ripped up and pulverized. So they're coming along slowly to biblical truth. So when you dig up a bone in the ground, does the bone have a label saying it was 65 million years old? Of course not. We need to understand that fossils don't come with labels saying how old they are. Scientists have to interpret or infer the age of the bones, so there's significant evidence in the fossil record that the fossils formed rapidly. And I'll start showing a video from Institute for Creation Research, and he'll show how fossils are formed.
You have to remember, not everything that dies becomes a fossil. In fact, fossilization is rare. Most dead plants and animals are usually eaten by scavengers or destroyed by bacteria. The things that are buried quickly in sand and mud, like in a flood or a landslide, have a better chance of becoming fossils. And animal soft tissues, that's skin and internal organs, usually rot away, even when buried, leaving only bones. As the material around a fossilized bone is cleared away by erosion, the fossil becomes exposed.
So it has to be buried quickly. What does Darwin say about fossilization? He said no organism wholly soft can be preserved in the fossil record. Let's see if he's right. Here's a fossil of a fish eating a fish. How do you get a fossil of a fish eating a fish? Does that take millions of years? Will those fish last that long to be fossilized? And there's another picture of an actual fish eating a fish. No, it had to occur fast. I have a little video showing it. Here's a fish eating another little fish, and then suddenly here comes the deposits from Noah's flood, buries them quickly. They're buried, and so how did this fish fossil form? Sudden, catastrophic burial. I have another cartoon of, we got a fish swimming in the ocean, and here comes the sediment from the global flood. He's getting scared. The fish is rapidly buried, and the fish bones remain in the sedimentary layers trapped. So the requirements of fossilization is rapid burial and continued sediment accumulation. I'll give you another examples. Here is a 6-foot long ichthyosaur, a marine reptile, that was buried quickly by sediments. How fast? This ichthyosaur was giving birth to a baby ichthyosaur, and it was buried so quickly the baby didn't even come out yet fully. So how are you going to have millions of years of fossilization when you got a marine reptile buried so fast the mother didn't even have time to give birth? Here's fossil of turtles mating. They are in the mating stance, and they were fossilized so quickly that they were frozen in time. Now, turtles don't mate for millions of years, do they? They found several of these in the Mesopit, Germany area. What about a fossilized wasp? This wasp was fossilized so quickly, you can still see the wings, the delicate striations of the wasp. That didn't happen in millions of years. It would decay a lot quicker. Here's a fossilized plant. A plant can't survive for millions of years. Plants decay quickly, right? You pull it out of the ground, it's dying right away. Something had to bury this plant and fossilize it very fast. Another example is a toothed whale found in the fossil bluff in Tasmania, and it was found in the same fossil graveyard or fossil bluff as a marsupial possum. Now, why would a whale who lives out in the ocean be found buried together with a possum who's on the land? Because it was caused by the global flood coming on the land and killing them together and burying them in the sediment, making them fossils. So when's the last time you saw whales and possums living together? You don't. And there's no way to explain it but with a global flood. We have more rapid burials of creatures, and here's an exquisite fossil preservation of another fish, and here's another fish where you can see the scales in detail. It's pretty amazing. And like I have a trilobite up here, it's a smaller one. There's a fossil trilobite, and it almost looks real, doesn't it? Does anyone know what that's a fossil of? Any guesses at all? Think of a sea creature. It is a fossil jellyfish. Now, and the scientists discovered hundreds of fossilized jellyfish, and that had to form in less than a day. Why? Jellyfish have no hard parts at all. They're 95% water. How could they be fossilized? In fact, when jellyfish are caught in coastal storms, they're washed onto the shore, and there's a picture of a jellyfish fighting for survival, and they start pumping on the sand to get ready for the next wave to hopefully save them. But they're 95% water. They won't survive time at all. That's why they have to be fossilized within an hour. That's how fast it happened in the global flood. We find a fossilized worm in China. We find fossilized animal manure. I have a short video that goes into more depth on how fossilization occurs and why we don't see it today.
Dead organisms usually don't last long. Scavengers and bacteria consume them quickly. Soft tissues rarely last more than days or weeks, and hard parts like bones or shells only a month or two. But the rocks of Earth contain billions and billions of fossils, and in many places, millions of fossils are exquisitely preserved, even soft parts. How could this be? To preserve a body, it needs to be put in a safe place. Extremely cold or dry places would protect them, but most organisms don't live in those conditions. There is another solution: rapid burial. If a body is sealed from oxygen and out of reach of burrowing animals, then it has a good chance of fossilizing intact. Rapid burial is uncommon today, but there's much evidence of massive burials in the past. Not only are many fossils well preserved, they're found amidst very fine sediment layers. Fine layers rarely last in the present because all sorts of animals are digging around in the mud and soil, searching for food. In just a few weeks or months, the original layers are destroyed. but in the fossil record, churned up sediments are rare. If these sediments were laid down rapidly, however, they'd prevent burrowers from doing their job. And there are thousands of feet of such layers in the fossil record all over the world. This suggests that moving water laid down mud and sand rapidly over a wide area, and the process lasted several months. A year-long global flood, as described in the Bible, is the best explanation we know for the well-preserved fossils and fine layering throughout the rocks of the Earth.
So I hope that video helps you understand more about fossilization. Now let's transition. How long does it take to form and erode rocks? Here's a clip called Magic in the Marsh, and let's see what they have to say. Without any regard to the laws of geology, mud on the marsh is hardening into stone in a few years rather than the thousands it usually takes. Okay, stop for a second. How do they know it takes thousands of years to fossilize? Were they there to see it? Do they have witnesses that it takes thousands of years? No. They assume it takes thousands of years. It's a belief. Here's another article from Eastern Daily Press, Norfolk, United Kingdom, on October 1994. Professor Coleman said the rock was forming faster than anybody had ever believed possible, with one stone creating itself in just 6 months. They often contain beautiful preserved fossils where the detail of the soft flesh of the creature is caught as well as the bone, and it had no time to rot before the rock formed around it. I highlighted believed because it's a belief system. They believed that it wasn't possible to do in such a short time. Also, I want to discuss floods. Here's an example in the Canyon Lake spillway during a 2002 flood in Texas. And during the peak of that flood, the river was flowing at 107,000 cubic feet per second. Normal flow was 175 cubic feet per second. So this river was moving 600 times faster than normal. Look at the damage that flash flood caused. Water ripped away through this highway. See how the highway is just washed out? And it cut down through this rock all the way out here in hours. So look at the damage that a flash flood can cause. This is just one local flood. Imagine what a worldwide flood can do. Here's a picture of some of the boulders that the water was carrying, and there's a man right here, and you can see for comparison or scale that the size of these rocks are huge. Moving water can carry the rocks the size of cars, and that's one local flood. Imagine a global flood. It could destroy the earth. And here's a video about rock layers from the Creation Museum I want to play. And it discussed the transport of sediment and rock across the world.
Rock layers are visible in mountains, plateaus, and canyons all over the world. Where did these rock layers come from? Present processes aren't the answer. Today, sand and mud are usually deposited in thin layers along the outer edge of continents, and the formation of fossils today is rare. But somehow in the past, thick layers of sand and mud were spread across entire continents and filled with well-preserved fossils. Noah's flood suggests a way to explain these puzzling features. Flooding the continents, for example, could carry sea creatures many hundreds of feet above present sea level. Andrew Snelling is a PhD geologist from Australia who has spent over 30 years studying rocks, working in the field and in the lab.
We find marine creatures buried at the top of the Grand Canyon, which is over a mile above sea level.
A global flood could carry sand and mud enormous distances.
Some of the sand grains that are in the Navajo sandstone had to have come from the Appalachians. But what river or what process today is carrying material from the Appalachians to the southwest?
A global flood could quickly lay down thick layers of mud and sand, burying even giant animals and tall trees.
We've got coal beds with trees sitting on them, and these trees, tree stumps, go through many strata, which means that before they could rot, you had to have lots of sand and mud coming in quickly. Several places in the Grand Canyon, 4,000 feet of different types of sand and mud and lime have been bent, and they've been bent while they're still soft. Both the bottom layer and the top layer are all bent the same way, which means that the whole sequence of 4,000 feet of sand and mud and lime had to have been laid down very quickly by the waters and then bent very soon afterwards.
A global flood could form thick layers across entire continents.
In the Grand Canyon area, we've got limestone bed, the red wall limestone. The same limestone can be found over here in the eastern United States.
A global flood could cut deeply and widely.
We've got this huge flat surface at the rim of the Grand Canyon, which goes for thousands of square miles, where waters on a great scale over a vast area just swept over it and swept everything clean.
None of these processes, deep, wide erosion, or thick, rapid layering, or continent-wide distribution, or lifting of marine organisms above sea level, or sand carried across continents, occur in the present. Radically different processes are required, such as occurred during Noah's flood.
Anybody hear of Mount St. Helens? Okay, I see show of hands, good, great. 43 years ago, May 18th, 1980, at 8:32 a.m., Mount St. Helens erupted. The main eruption would last 9 hours, and this was a godsend to creationists. And I'll play this video. And the eruption carved out canyons in hours and looked reminiscent to the Grand Canyon, but 40 times smaller in size.
On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens, located 95 miles south of Seattle, Washington, erupted. The eruption was triggered by an earthquake centered beneath the mountain that measured 5.1 on the Richter scale. The lateral blast swept out the north side of Mount St. Helens at 300 miles per hour. With temperatures as high as 660 degrees Fahrenheit and the power of 24 megatons of thermal energy, it snapped 100-year-old trees like toothpicks and stripped them of their bark. Before the famous eruption at Mount St. Helens, scientists were mostly familiar with slow-acting examples of geologic change. But at Mount St. Helens, geologists watched the Earth's surface change quite rapidly. Icebergs were buried in hot avalanche material. They melted and formed badlands in days. Eruptions on May 18 and June 10 produced fine layers in hours. On June 10, mud flows cut zigzag canyons 100 feet deep in soft sand and mud, complete with perpendicular side canyons. Canyons that are reminiscent of the geography of Grand Canyon, only 40 times smaller and clearly produced within hours. Mud flows over the following decade cut hundreds of feet into solid rock in just days of cutting time. Fallen trees formed a log mat on the surface of Spirit Lake and dropped bark to the bottom of the lake, accumulating up to 3 feet of bark peat in just a couple years. And vertically floating logs sinking to the bottom of the lake resulted in buried trees in only a decade, similar to the trees of Yellowstone's fossil forest, which are also buried in volcanic layers. Even though Mount St. Helens is a very small catastrophe compared to the flood, or the major catastrophes immediately following the flood, it provides a better clue to what happened in those times than the slow geologic processes which are most commonly seen in the present.
So after the eruption, a third of the mountain disappeared, but a lava dome started forming soon after, and it continues to grow to this day, even at a faster rate than the first 6 years. In fact, there's a picture 40 years later on May 2020, and I want to highlight, notice a new lava dome is building. I'll show you why that's important. Dr. Andrew Snelling, you saw a picture of him earlier, collected samples from this new formed lava dome rock in 1992 from that lava dome at Mount St. Helens. The samples were sent to a respected lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they were told that the samples he collected, that they were from a dacite rock, low levels of argon were expected, and the lab dated the rock sample in 14 different mineral samples. And what came back? The age, a radiometric age of anywhere from 340,000 years to 2.8 million years. The actual age was 12 years old, so this demonstrates how inaccurate the radiometric dating is. When we know the date of the rock from the eruption and the lava formed, and you don't tell the secularists, they come back with millions of years regardless. Another eruption in New Zealand. This is New Zealand's most active volcano with 61 eruptions since 1839, and the most recent in 1977, and they had 5 eruptions from 1949 to 1975, I think another one in 77. So Dr. Andrew Snelling collected samples from this eruption and sent them back to a top U.S. lab for dating. He didn't tell the lab where the samples were collected, but he suggested that they could be young, so as to ensure the lab would take extra care in their analysis. And they used potassium argon method, and what came back, these rocks were 270,000 to 3.5 million years old. So we have a major problem with these dating methods, because the rocks were less than 50 years old when he pulled them from the eruption and went to make them dated. So if we have rocks of known age, like Mount St. Helens in New Zealand, and the dating methods don't work, how can we trust when they say rocks of unknown age and the dating methods are assumed to work? Here's a video on radiometric dating. I'm probably going to skip this one because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time. So I will go. So when we look at the rocks in the Grand Canyon, the secularists will tell us that this is the witness of millions of years. But the Bible says, and observational science and common sense should tell us, this is a witness to Noah's flood, because it was a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude that destroyed the earth and laid down sediments, bearing creatures alive in those sediments. Now, secular scientists don't believe in an earthly global flood, but you know where they believe the flood was? Mars. Not on Earth, but Mars. Here's a quote: "A flood of biblical proportions enough to fill the Mediterranean Sea gushed down from the highlands of Mars a billion or so years ago." The latest pictures from the Pathfinder confirmed Monday. This was back in 1997. "The total release of gases from Tharsis Magna may have produced the equivalent of a global layer of water nearly 400 feet deep at the very end of a Noachian epoch." They even used Noah's name. Volcanic activity dissipated. Now, was Noah's flood on Mars? They have the flood on the wrong planet, right? This is difficult for people to understand. How can brilliant scientists at NASA and other places believe in a flood on Mars where to date there's no evidence of a single drop of liquid water? Yet they scoff at creationists for believing in a global flood on planet Earth that's 72% covered with water. Then they say that where did all the water from Noah's flood come from or go to? Well, let's answer that question. Where is all the water from the Genesis flood? Right now, water covers 72% of the earth. And we have a creation scientist, A.R. Wallace, who wrote this back in 1903. And he said the mean depth of the seas are 13,860 feet. That's the depth of the oceans. The average height of the land is only 2,250 feet. So the mean depth of the seas are 6 times deeper than the height of the land. There's a lot of water in those oceans. So if you flatten the seas or raise the seas and lowered the mountains, water would cover the earth 2 miles high today. It's still there. If you say, where's the water from the Genesis flood? Just tell someone, go to the beach. It's there right now. The Lord lowered the oceans so the water could drain off into these deep oceans. So thinking about scientists believing the flood on Mars and not Earth, let's read Romans 1:20-21. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. I can demonstrate this when Bill Nye stated that you and I are descendants of Martians when he was in the Nye-Ham second debate at the Ark Encounter.
You find these shock patterns and you find the minerals from Mars. So it is not crazy, it's extraordinary, but not crazy to suggest that Mars was hit with an impactor through what's generally called a Hohmann orbit, an orbit where it falls toward the sun but ends up on the Earth. You and I are descendants of Martians.
Okay,
that
and
is
that's
not crazy.
And that's not crazy? Is it crazy that you and I are descendants of Adam and Eve?
We are descendants from a common ancestor. I don't
But
know
is
that
it
they went
crazy
by
that
those names.
is it crazy that God made the first man and woman and we're descendants of them?
For me, there's no evidence of that.
So is that crazy?
But
I wouldn't use that word.
What would you say?
It's you're betraying your intellect. You're not using your head. That's what I would
So
say.
you're saying it is crazy?
It's frustrating.
which is more crazy, though?
But
being
you're saying we're
descended from a
descendants of Martians, and that's not crazy?
I say it is not crazy. It's extraordinary, but not crazy.
Okay,
and
so-
we have a process
so where-
by which we can prove that. That's what's so exciting.
Prove that we're Bill, I want you to do that for all these young people. Prove that we're descendants from Martians.
I can't prove that right now. I don't know
thought
where
you
you
said
were
we-
the last minute and a half.
I thought you said we
We
could.
want to send spacecraft there. Okay. We have a process by which we can make this discovery.
Okay.
And it could be on Europa. There might be something
What if
alive.
there is no discovery?
Well, that's
You don't
also
discover
extraordinary.
anything.
That makes us even more unusual in the universe.
Are you prepared to take... We have a book called the Bible that says it is the Word of God who made all things. Who said, here's what happened in the past. Are you prepared to take that and consider it in regard to the evidence you see in the present?
So I claim, Mr. Ham, that I spent a lot of time with it. I read it twice.
Uh-huh.
I followed the guys around on the maps.
Uh-huh.
I decided that humans made the whole thing up.
He read it twice and followed humans, and we all made it up. Okay. Back to Derek Yeager. We have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed. This is really not a science issue. The evolutionists have nothing. They just don't want to believe in a God. They want to remove Moses from science. We read that clip earlier. And here's millions of years back in the 1800s, scientists said, the Bible's not true. These rock layers show that the earth is millions of years old. You have to believe me because I'm a scientist. And what does the theologian say? I'll just accept the millions of years and add them to the Bible. Gleason Archer, he was an Old Testament expert, and I think he passed away, but he wrote this: from a superficial reading of Genesis 1, the impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, this seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. So which authority are we going to believe? The infallible word of our holy God, or are we going to believe fallible opinions of sinful men? If we believe God's word is truth, then let's put on our biblical glasses and trust God's word. Or if you believe man decides truth and millions of years, then you have more evolutionized glasses on. I'll end with some Bible verses, John 3:19 through 20. And this is the condemnation that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. Verse 20, for everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. So the Bible teaches sin darkens the mind, sin distorts our thinking, leads us to practicing evil. And then a person who loves darkness and hates the light of the Word of God and does not come to the light of Jesus, our Savior from sin, because they don't want their evil deeds exposed. And then this passage, I love 2 Peter 3 through, we go through 6. Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willingly forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So I counted 2 key things that they forgot. Well, 3. They willingly are forgetting, they don't want to believe the second coming. That was in the first part. They willingly forget that God through his word created the heavens and the earth, and they willingly forget the world perished by being flooded with water. So they're willingly forgetting the creation and the global flood, and even Jesus' second coming. So those who went into the ark were saved from the flood. So the ark door can be viewed as a picture of salvation through Jesus, because Jesus talked about him being a door. In John chapter 10, verses 7 and 9 says, then Jesus said to them again, most assuredly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. So before I close, any questions? Yes, Pastor.
Mark, with the flood, when it happened, all the catastrophic things that took place, can we really identify locations before the flood, after the flood, like the Euphrates River? We don't really know where.
That's a good question, right? No, that whole world was destroyed, and it was covered up on average by 6,000 feet of sediments. It was totally buried and gone. Remember I showed a couple weeks ago where they found this axe that didn't rust, and that was buried in stone, and they found artifacts that was buried, but no, that world is totally wiped out. So it's gone. There's no way we can find things buried or fossilized in the rocks, but that's it. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I have questions. I have comments and questions.
Okay.
I remember when I was leaving high school and I started a technical graduation, and the first company I visited was a ferroalloy manufacturing facility. And then I fell in love with the work with high temperature and metal melting and what they were doing with that. But we also study what we call powder metallurgy. And when we talk about rocks today, they may be like what they call sediment, or sedimental rock. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? We can easily create that in a couple of minutes. But we can also create like crystal rock rapidly. If I use enough temperature to melt the ingredient.
Okay. Yep.
I normally create what is the crystal and what is it's part of it will be left over, which would not be part of the main crystal, but will be secondary crystals and things like that. We do it every single day in the industry.
Okay. Yeah.
So the thing that you need millions and millions of years to create something contradicts what is done every single day in the industry.
Excellent point. Yes.
So, but the question that I have is, when I look and that's from a creationist point of view, and also, but the same question could be made to people from evolution,
Yeah.
right? Why the process that create the Grand Canyon and some other canyons? I don't see it everywhere in the globe. If the flood came and covered everything, why it's not everything like Grand Canyon?
Okay, I'll address that coming up. How did the Grand Canyon form? That's different. That happened after the flood, and we'll talk about that piece after the flood. Basically, what happened was there was residual water that was still, Salt Lake City, the Great Salt Lake, was massive back right after the flood. All those basins in the west were filled with water, and the Grand Canyon had this massive waterway that was filled up, and it busted through and tore out that canyon. And that's how we see the layers, because that Colorado River was so small, there's no way you could create that massive canyon. But it was after the flood, you had these big lakes, and there was a dam that burst and carved right through it. There's another place called there's the Missoula flood, same thing. Now secular scientists believe that flood happened with one of these dams bursting and carving it out, in days or hours. Yeah. Any others? Okay, so lesson 2, series 2, I like to leave with 3 key questions. What was the purpose of the Genesis flood? Yeah, more than man. Remember, it was the animals, the birds, and the earth. So God was destroying everything, and that shows how much He hates sin, And that's a picture of Jesus' second coming too, because Jesus talked about that. He's going to destroy the second time with what? Exactly, with fire. How long does it take to make fossils? Yeah, right. It has to happen so fast that it could fossilize a jellyfish, mating turtles, ichthyosaur giving birth. Yeah. And how long does it take to form and erode rocks? Think of flash floods and, no time at all. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.